When Lina stepped out of the taxi, the city's evening lights were fading wearily on the pale facade of the Sovereign Hotel. The building stood like a tired giant from the past, surrounded by modern glass towers. It was clear from every detail that it had once been a symbol of wealth and elegance. The carved stone ornaments, the massive windows, and the rusted wrought iron awning over the entrance all whispered of better days long gone. But now grime filled the crevices of the ornaments, and the windows reflected a dull, lifeless void to anyone who looked in. The hotel's name was written in gilded letters as Sovereign, but the gilding had peeled off some letters, revealing a dark, rusted metal underneath dot as she stepped inside through the hissing automatic doors. The first thing that hit her was the smell of time. This was not the sweet, papery scent of an old library. It was more like a forgotten attic, a mixture of dust, dampness, and the heavy odor of velvet curtains that hadn't been aired in years, poorly masked by the cloying floral notes of a cheap air freshener. The lobby was even gloomier than the building's exterior. The massive chandelier hanging from the ceiling must have once sparkled with hundreds of crystals, but now most of its bulbs were out, and the remaining ones cast a sick yellow light. The patterns on the red carpet had been worn away by thousands of feet, replaced by dark, undefined stains. There was no one else in the lobby. No sound of suitcases, no laughter from guests. Only the hum of the air conditioning and the unsettling tick-tock of the grandfather clock on the wall, each second landing like a warning. The reception desk was in the darkest corner of the room. Lina walked slowly toward it, the weight of the backpack on her shoulders. Each of her steps felt like an accusation, breaking the silence. Behind the counter sat an old man whose face was barely visible in the dim light. He didn't even lift his head from the large ledger in front of him as she approached. It was as if her very presence was an unwelcome disturbance to the hotel's heavy, slow-moving current of time. Lina cleared her throat. "Good evening," she sighed, her voice weaker and more trembling than she expected. "I have a reservation." When the old man heard her voice, he lifted his head with a slow movement, as if waking from a deep sleep. His eyes were like two dark pits in the dim light, and the deep lines on his face were like a map of the cracks in the hotel's walls. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on a point over her shoulder, perhaps on the pendulum of the grandfather clock. "Name?" he asked, his voice muffled and tired, as if coming from a grave. Lina gave her first and last name. The man began to trace the yellowed pages of the massive leather-bound ledger with his bony finger. His finger moved over the names with the slowness of a snail. Finally it stopped. "Ah, yes," he murmured. "Single room, 1 week." It sounded less like a confirmation and more like a diagnosis. The man bent down and pulled out an old brass keychain from under the counter, with a heavy key dangling from it. He held it up to the light to read the numbers engraved on it. Room 1308. As Lina reached for the key, the man's cold, dry fingers brushed against her hand for a moment. The touch was unexpectedly disturbing. "The 13th floor?" Lina asked involuntarily. She knew many hotels skip the 13th floor due to superstition. For the first time, the man turned his eyes directly to hers. In that moment, she realized his eyes were not just dark pits, but held a pale, almost colorless grayness within them. "At the Sovereign, every floor has its place, madam," he said, with a strange, almost mocking tone in his voice. "We skip nothing." The man turned back to his ledger, his presence once again ceasing to exist for Lina. Lina hesitated for a moment, the heavy key in her hand. Something was not right in this hotel. In its air, in its silence, in this man's gaze, there was an oddness in everything. But she was tired, it was cold outside, and she didn't have the strength to look for another hotel. "Which way to the elevator?" she asked. Without looking up, the receptionist pointed with his hand to the even darker end of the lobby. There, in the shadows, stood an old door with tarnished brass plating, with the word "elevator" written on It thought Lina walked toward the shadowy corner the receptionist had indicated. The elevator door was made of brass that had once shone, but was now covered in fingerprints and dark stains. When she pressed the call button, the mechanical groan from within sounded like the creaking of an old man's bones. As the doors opened with a hesitant jolt, the inside was smaller than she expected, and a strange, sweetish smell mixed with rust hung in the air. Lina stepped inside and closed the iron-gated inner door with her own hand. As the cabin began to rise with groans and jolts, it seemed to pause at every floor, as if picking up an invisible passenger. As the numbers on the brass plate indicating the floors slowly turned, Lina felt as if she were ascending to the sky in a coffin. The elevator stopped with a sudden jolt when it reached the 13th floor. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a silence even deeper and a darkness more intense than in the lobby. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, and a single flickering bulb in the ceiling cast long, eerie shadows on the worn-out carpet. The wallpaper was peeling from the damp, and in places, the ghosts of older, darker patterns were visible underneath. In the air, there was a smell of decay mixed with mothballs that she couldn't identify. Lina looked at the heavy key in her hand and began to walk down the corridor, searching for her room number. Her footsteps were muffled and lifeless on the carpet. As she neared the end of the corridor, she heard what sounded like a whisper behind her. She stopped and looked back. The corridor was empty. Only the shadows created by the flickering bulb were dancing. She blamed it on her fatigue. She must have been imagining things. She continued to walk, but this time her steps were faster. She heard the whisper again. This time it was clearer. It wasn't like a word, more like the thin, mournful sound of wind passing through a keyhole. Her heart began to beat rapidly. Finally, she found the peeling door with 1308 on it. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the lock. The lock turned with a rusty groan. As she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the whispering from behind her stopped abruptly, as if it had ended right at the nape of her neck. Without daring to look back, Lina quickly entered and slammed the door, locking it. She leaned her back against the door and listened for a moment, holding her breath. Outside, there was only the sound of the hotel's old walls and her own rapidly beating heart. The inside of the room was hardly any brighter than the corridor. Heavy, mothball-scented curtains covered the single window tightly, and when Lina parted them, the only thing she saw was the mossy, dark brick wall of another building just a few feet away. The faint city light that seeped in cast a ghostly glow on the room's shabby furniture. In the center stood a large bed with a creaking iron frame. In one corner, a wardrobe with worn carvings, and directly opposite, a dressing table with a stained, tarnished mirror. The air was so still that Lina could feel her own breathing was the only movement in the room. She dropped her backpack on the bed and sat down for a moment. The bed's springs protested with a painful groan. Fatigue made all her bones ache, but sleep was the last thing she wanted right now. She had an irrational but powerful feeling that she was not alone in this room. Her eyes began to scan the dim corners. The wardrobe door was not completely closed. A pitch-black darkness stared out from the gap. She pulled the cord of the lamp. On the dressing table, the lamp flickered for a moment and then filled the room with a trembling yellow light. This light, rather than being comforting, only elongated and animated the shadows in the room. Lina sat in front of the dressing table and looked at her reflection in the tarnished mirror. Behind her, the rest of the room stretched out, distorted and unsettling. As she sat there, her eyes fixed on her reflection, she noticed something move at the edge of the mirror, just at the periphery of her vision. It was a quick, fleeting shadow. It was as if someone had ducked quickly from behind the bed to the wardrobe. Her heart in her throat, she suddenly spun around. The room was empty. Nothing had moved. The wardrobe door was still ajar in the same way. She tried to calm herself. "It's just fatigue," she whispered, "and the lights in this godforsaken hotel." But when she turned back to the mirror, she could have sworn that the room behind her reflection was different from the one she had just looked at. It was as if the shadows had shifted in the brief moment she had turned her back. Lina got up from the mirror and began to pace the room. The narrow space ended in a few steps. She couldn't stay in this room. The anxiety inside her made her feel as if the walls were closing in. Perhaps getting some fresh air, or at least seeing another human face, even that of the strange receptionist in the lobby, would calm her down. She headed for the door. The brass knob was ice cold. The creak of the lock turning echoed like a scream in the silence. She slowly opened the door and glanced into the corridor. The corridor was as empty and silent as she had left it. The light from the flickering bulb still cast unsettling shadows on the long stretch of carpet. She took a deep breath and stepped into the corridor. But as she turned to close her door behind her, she noticed small, overlapping letters carved into the wood, right next to the doorknob. They didn't look like a name, more like meaningless symbols a child might have scribbled randomly. She was sure she hadn't noticed them before. She ran her fingertip over the carvings. The wood was rough, as if freshly carved. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. Just then, she heard a muffled sound from one of the rooms down the corridor. It was a thud, as if a piece of furniture had been dragged a few inches across a wooden floor. Lina froze. She hadn't thought there was anyone else on this floor. Perhaps she wasn't alone, and the thought was as comforting as it was frightening. Her curiosity overcame her fear. She began to walk on her tiptoes in the direction of the sound. Her steps felt like a risky journey on the creaking floorboards. The sound had come from room 1312. She stood in front of the door and pressed her ear against it. There was no sound from inside. Perhaps she had been mistaken. As she moved to turn back, she noticed a faint light seeping from under the door, breaking the pitch darkness inside. Involuntarily, she reached for the doorknob. She would just try it. It had to be locked, but the knob turned under her hand without the slightest resistance, and the door opened inward with a soft creak. Lina's breath caught. She looked through the opening. The room was identical to hers, the same bed, the same wardrobe. But it was completely empty. No suitcase, no person. And in the middle of the room, on an old chair standing alone, a single candle was burning. Its flame was dancing wildly, as if being blown by an invisible breath, despite there being no draft in the room. In that moment, Lina knew it was a trap. This room was calling to her. She pulled back, closed the door silently, and without looking back, ran quickly to her own room. When she locked the door and slid the bolt, her heart was pounding as if it would break out of her chest. She was sure now. She was not alone in this hotel. And whatever it was, it knew she was there. Lina didn't know how long she stood with her back against the door, listening to the echo of her own pounding heart in her chest. Her body was rigid, expecting a sound, a creak, from the other side of the door at any moment. But the outside was as silent as a grave. This silence was more frightening than a sound. It was as if the entire hotel was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. She slowly moved away from the door and retreated to the farthest corner of the room, by the window. She tried to make herself feel as small as possible. Her eyes scanned every shadow, every object in the room as a potential threat. It was then that she noticed the old black telephone on the small nightstand next to the bed. It was a rotary model with a cracked receiver and a cloth-covered cord. It was covered in such a thick layer of dust that it was clear no one had touched it in years. She even saw that the phone cord wasn't even plugged into the wall socket. The cable was lying loose next to the baseboard. For some reason, this sight briefly relieved her. Even if she had no connection to the outside world, she thought at least no unwanted sound could intrude into this room. Just as this thought crossed her mind, the telephone began to ring. The sound was not like the digital melody of modern phones. It was a harsh mechanical ringing, the kind from old movies, of metal striking metal. Lina froze where she stood. This was impossible. The phone didn't work. Its cord wasn't even plugged in, but the ringing continued. Insistent, relentless, and real. The sound cut through the room's stagnant air like a saw, drilling directly into her brain. For a moment, she thought it was a hallucination, a trick of her tired mind, but the sound didn't stop. On the contrary, it seemed to grow louder, more impatient. Unable to bear it any longer, she walked towards the phone as if hypnotized. With a trembling hand, she lifted the bakelite receiver, which was ice cold. The ringing stopped instantly. Lina hesitantly brought the receiver to her ear. "Hello?" she whispered. There was no answer from the other end of the line. Only a deep, intense static, just like the sound of an empty radio channel. But beneath the static, there was another sound. It was a muffled, rhythmic, and wet sound, as if someone were trying to breathe underwater, the bubbles from their mouth hitting the surface. Then, through the water and the static, she thought, she heard a whisper, her own name, Lina. The voice was the same as the whisper in the corridor, but this time it was closer, deeper. It was as if it wasn't on the other end of the line, but right inside the receiver, right next to her own ear. Lina screamed and threw the receiver. The phone hit the floor and cracked with a sharp sound. But that muffled underwater sound had continued to echo in the room, if only for a moment. Panic spread through Lina's veins like an icy poison. Echoes of that wet, muffled whisper still seemed to seep from the cracked receiver of the fallen telephone. She was no longer thinking, only moving. A primal survival instinct had taken over. Her body, fatigue, logic, all of it was gone. All that remained was a single purpose: to get out of this room, to get off this floor, to escape this hotel. She snatched her backpack from the bed and lunged for the door. Her fingers trembled so much as she pulled the bolt and turned the lock that her first few attempts failed. Every second felt like a moment in which the invisible presence she felt at her neck drew closer. When she finally opened the door, the silence of the corridor hit her like a wall. It was empty, but this was not a comforting emptiness. It was the unsettling emptiness of the moment before a storm, when everything holds its breath. The light from the flickering bulb created frightening faces on the peeling patterns of the walls, and the shadows on the carpet seemed to move whenever she wasn't looking. Lina forced herself not to look at the door of room 1312. She didn't want to know what was waiting behind it. She ran towards the elevator with all her might. This time, her footsteps tore through the silence like an alarm. When she reached the tarnished brass door of the elevator, she began to press the call button repeatedly, striking it with the palm of her hand. With each press, a faint light seeped from the plastic cracks around the button, then died again. The wait felt longer than a century. During this time, her back was to the elevator door, her eyes fixed on the dark end of the corridor. She expected something to appear from that darkness at any moment, a silhouette to form. She felt as if the door of the room at the end of the corridor would creak open, or a face would look at her from behind a torn piece of wallpaper. Finally, the familiar, pained groan was heard from deep within the walls. The elevator was coming when the doors opened with a protesting creak. Lina threw herself inside without hesitation. She quickly pulled the iron-gated door shut, and as soon as she turned around, She pressed her finger on the worn button with the letter L. The button sank in, but the confirmation light that should have lit up did not. The doors closed, and the cabin was plunged into pitch darkness. For a moment, the light in the ceiling had also gone out. In that brief darkness, Lina could have sworn she was not alone in the cabin. It was as if she had felt the warm, moist breath of someone right in front of her. When the lamp flickered back on a moment later, the cabin was empty. But the elevator was not moving. It was not going down. It was just standing still. In a panic, Lina pressed the L button again. Then the first floor, the second floor, the alarm button. There was no response. The cabin was a metal coffin, suspended between floors. Just as she was about to give up hope and start pounding on the doors, the elevator moved with a sudden jolt. But not down, up. The floor indicator slowly passed the number 13 and creaked to 14. Then, 15. There were no corresponding buttons for these floors on the panel. The elevator was pulling her towards an unknown, unmapped area of the hotel. The elevator stopped on the 10th floor with a shuddering groan. The existence of this floor was an anomaly, but the opening of the doors froze Lina's blood. The outside was pitch black. There was no corridor. Only a bottomless velvet void stretched out. Neither a wall nor a floor was visible. It was as if the hotel had brought her directly to the heart of the night, to the brink of nothingness. Lina held her breath and shrank into the farthest corner of the cabin. She was terrified of being pulled into that darkness outside. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, as if allowing an invisible guest standing right in front of the elevator to pass, the doors slowly closed again. As the cabin began to move again, Lina's panic gave way to a strange, incomprehensible game. This time the elevator was going down. It reached the 14th floor and stopped. The doors opened. Again, the same bottomless darkness. In fear, Lina looked at the button panel. Maybe a button was stuck. With trembling fingers, she began to press all the floor buttons randomly. The buttons sank in, but no light came on. They were dead under her fingers. The doors closed again. It descended to the 13th floor. The doors opened. The dim, unsettling corridor she knew was there. For a moment, a glimmer of hope for escape was born. But just as she was about to step out, she heard a click from the end of the corridor and froze. The door to room 1312 was slowly creaking open. Lina screamed and threw herself back into the cabin. The elevator doors closed slowly, as if mocking her panic. She was sure now. This elevator wasn't taking her anywhere. It was playing with her. It was repeatedly throwing her, like prey, before whatever was in the corridor. In desperation, she collapsed in the corner of the cabin and made herself as small as possible. Maybe if she didn't move, if she stayed quiet, this game would end. She closed her eyes tightly. The elevator stopped again. This time the doors did not open. But Lina felt the air in the cabin change. That familiar, wet and rotten smell was now even more intense. And she felt that warm, moist breath on the back of her neck again. She didn't dare open her eyes. That thing, whoever or whatever it was now inside this metal box with her. Lina was curled up like a fetus on the cold metal floor of the cabin. Her eyes squeezed shut. She had lost her sense of time and space. There was only that wet, rotten smell and that terrifying, moist breath on her neck. She was expecting a touch, a whisper, at any moment. The terror of not knowing what that thing would do was worse than any physical attack. Her mind was producing horrific scenarios that played out in the cabin. Had a few seconds passed or minutes? She didn't know. But then, she felt a weight on her shoulder. It wasn't the weight of a hand. It was more like a wet, heavy cloth being laid upon her. The coldness seeped through the fabric of her jacket and into her skin. This touch shattered the last of Lina's control. Her eyes flew open, and she screamed, throwing herself forward. When her body hit the other corner of the cabin, the wet weight on her shoulder was gone, but she was sure it had been there. She scrambled to her feet and, with her back against the wall, scanned the seemingly empty interior of the cabin. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice trembling with panic and rage. "Let me go." In response, she heard only a faint from the elevator's mechanism. Desperation gave way to a momentary frantic energy. She was no longer trying to escape. She was fighting. She threw herself at the button panel and began to hit every button with her palms, her fists, her nails. Her goal was no longer to select a floor. It was to inflict pain on this machine, to disturb whatever was controlling it. Her movements were erratic and bizarre. One moment she was pressing against the panel, the next she was trying to hide in a blind spot of the cabin, as if from someone. Then she would lunge out again, making meaningless gestures towards her invisible enemy, whispering something. "I see you," she hissed into the void. "I know you're there." In the midst of this moment of madness, the elevator made a sudden sound. All the buttons lit up with a red light, as if pressed simultaneously. And then they began to go out, one by one, from the top floor to the bottom like a countdown. 15, 14. When the lights stopped on the 13th floor, the elevator stopped with a slight jolt, and the doors slowly creaked open. Before her was the same dim, flickering corridor. But this time it was different. In the middle of the corridor, right in front of room 1312, something was on the floor. It was a wet, dark stain, and it was slowly spreading among the patterns of the carpet, as if something was dripping from the ceiling above. Lina was trapped between the terror inside the elevator and the unknown in the corridor. But she couldn't stay in the cabin for another second. She took a deep breath and threw herself out. She ran towards the lobby without looking back for even a moment. Lina's frantic run down the corridor was like running in a dream. Her legs felt as heavy as lead, the floor seeming to slip from under her with every step, and the corridor itself appeared to lengthen as she ran. There was no sound behind her, no sign of pursuit, but the image of the wet stain and the thought of that unknown liquid dripping from the ceiling were seared into her mind. She didn't even glance at the elevator as she passed it. She was looking for the stairs. Every hotel had to have a fire escape, but the corridors of the Sovereign seemed to twist into themselves in an endless loop like a labyrinth. Every corner looked the same, every door a replica of the last. Panic had completely taken over her sense of direction. She no longer knew which way she had come from or where her room was. Finally, at the end of a corridor, she saw a door with the faded word "exit" on it. It was a beacon of hope. She threw her full weight against the door, but the door wasn't locked. It wouldn't budge, as if there were tons of weight behind it. She pushed with her shoulders, with her whole body, but it was useless. The door, like the hotel itself, was old, stubborn, and impassable. In despair, she collapsed to the floor with her back against the door. Tears streamed down her cheeks, dripping onto the dusty floor. She was trapped here. This hotel had swallowed her, and it had no intention of letting her go. After sitting there for an unknown amount of time, she got up, exhausted. She had no strength left to run. She had no choice but to go back, to walk those corridors again. With slow steps, she began to walk in the direction she thought she had come from. With every step, she felt eyes watching her from between the torn patterns on the walls. Eventually, she arrived in front of a familiar door, 1308, her own room. She hesitated for a moment as she reached for the doorknob. Was the terror in the room less than the terror in the corridor? She didn't know. but at least it was a place. She knew. When she entered, she found everything as she had left it. The cracked receiver of the thrown telephone, the messy bed. The suffocating air of the room felt like a safe harbor at that moment. She threw herself into the bathroom, turned the faucet on full, and splashed handfuls of cold water on her face. This had to be a nightmare. She would wake up. When she lifted her head and looked into the steamy bathroom mirror, her blood ran. Cold at what she saw. The reflection in the mirror was not her own. Her face was there, yes, but its expression was different. Her eyes were not filled with fear like her own, but were looking back at her with a cold, indifferent, almost mocking expression. And when she smiled, her reflection's lips did not curve into a smile. It just kept staring. Then, slowly, the reflection in the mirror shook its head, as if to say, no. Lina screamed and stumbled back from the mirror. The stranger in the glass was still looking at her. The alien image in the mirror shattered the last remnants of logic in Lina's mind. She could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a hallucination. She slammed the bathroom door and threw herself back into the room. Her eyes darted around wildly, searching for an escape route, a weapon, anything she could hold on to. The room's only window. She tore aside the heavy, dusty curtains with a rage and pulled at the old window latch. The rusty metal resisted under her nails but finally gave way with a high-pitched screech. When she pushed the window upward, what hit her face was not a cool night breeze, but a cold, still and musty air, like that of a tomb. The view she saw when she looked out only deepened her despair. Below, a 13-story drop stretched down to a narrow, dark courtyard filled with trash containers and broken furniture. But that wasn't the most frightening part. The brick wall opposite was so close she could have reached out and touched it. And on that wall, directly across from her own window, was another window. This window had no glass, no frame. It was just a dark, empty mouth in the body of the building. And from within that darkness, she could have sworn a pair of eyes was watching her. There was no silhouette, no face. Just a pure, malevolent awareness focused on her from within that void. Lina screamed and pulled back from the window. This hotel wasn't just cursed, it was alive. Its walls were breathing, its windows were watching her. There was no escape. Still, she couldn't give up. The only heavy object in the room was the small wooden chair from the dressing table. She grabbed it and ran towards the room's door. She would no longer try to escape through the corridor or the elevator. She would break this door. She would get out of this cell the hotel had imprisoned her in. She lifted the chair over her head and with all her might, slammed it into the center of the door. On the first strike, a dull thud echoed and a slight crack appeared on the door. On the second strike, the crack deepened. On the third, the chair made a muffled sound, not as if hitting wood, but as if striking something soft and fleshy. Lina stopped in astonishment. The surface of the door where she had struck was no longer like hard wood. It had caved in slightly, like tissue under skin, and from the cracks, a dark molasses-like liquid began to ooze slowly. A nauseating smell, a mixture of rust and rotting meat, filled the room. The door was bleeding. Lina froze, the broken piece of the chair in her hand. Her eyes were locked on the dark, thick liquid flowing from the bleeding door. The nauseating smell of rust and meat burned her throat, making her gag. This was the point where reason and logic ended. A door could not bleed. Wood was not a tissue with veins. But the reality before her eyes screamed this impossibility in her face. She understood then. This hotel was not just cursed or haunted. This hotel was alive. A giant, breathing, bleeding organism, and she was nothing more than a parasite in its stomach. With this horrific realization, her perception of the room completely changed. When she looked around now, she no longer saw old furniture and worn wallpaper. The peeling sections of the wallpaper seemed to pulse slowly and rhythmically, like veins under a giant's skin. The wooden floor beneath her feet was no longer hard and lifeless. It flexed slightly, as if she were standing on the ribcage of a living creature. The carved patterns on the wardrobe in the corner had transformed into faces contorted in silent, screaming agony. And the bed was like the body of a huge, sleeping animal, breathing slowly, its ribs visible under the blanket. Lina slowly dropped the piece of chair. The instinct to flee, to fight, was gone. It was replaced by the numb resignation of a prey that has realized its fate. She could hear the sounds in the room more clearly now. This was not a whisper or a click from outside. This was a sound coming from the room itself, from within the walls, from beneath the floor. It was a deep, muffled, and rhythmic hum. Thump, thump, thump. Just like the beating of a giant heart. This was the heart of the hotel. And it had felt her presence. The hotel was no longer playing with her. It was preparing to digest her. Lina felt the walls slowly closing in, the ceiling lowering. The air in the room had thickened, becoming a humid and organic substance that made it difficult to breathe. In the depths of her mind, she heard a voice that could not be expressed in words. It was the consciousness of the hotel. A hungry, ancient, and lonely consciousness. It wanted her. Her fear, her memories, her soul. It wanted everything. This awareness blew the final fuse in Lina's mind. Fear gave way to a momentary clarity. The strange piece of madness. An expression similar to the cold, mocking one of her reflection in the mirror, spread across her face. And then, in the middle of that suffocating silence, Lina began to laugh. It was not a joyful laugh. It was the high-pitched, hysterical, and unending scream of a soul that had lost its mind, crushed under the weight of reality. Lina's laughter echoed in the living silence of the room, struck the walls, and ended in a muffled sob. With that final sound, all the fear, all the panic inside her, flowed away as if the floodgates of a dam had been opened. What remained was a deep, calm, and absolute emptiness, like the bottom of the ocean. The strange clarity brought by madness had taken over her mind. She was no longer fighting. There was nothing left to fight. She was not prey. She was a lost piece returning to the nest. This enlightenment was as peaceful as it was painful. The rhythmic heartbeat of the room, thump, 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 was no longer a threatening hum, but the soothing, familiar sound a baby hears in its mother's womb. The walls were no longer closing in on her. On the contrary, she felt the warmth of a protective, enveloping limb. The molasses-like liquid seeping from the bleeding door was no longer nauseating. It was the hotel's blood, its life essence, and Lina felt that she was a part of this circulation. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, she reached her hand to the nearest wall. When her fingertips touched the peeling wallpaper, she felt the warmth of skin beneath it, the vibration of a gently pulsing vein. She closed her eyes. With this touch, foreign images, unrelated to her own memories, began to flood her mind. For a moment, she found herself in this room, but in a different time. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, and the daylight seeping through the window was not faint and sick as it was now, but bright and vibrant. Then the image changed. This time, she was a man with a mustache, standing in the same room, looking around with fearful eyes. In another image, she was a little girl sitting on the bed, holding a toy doll. These were the memories of the hotel, the echoes of countless souls it had swallowed, digested, and made a part of its own consciousness before her. Lina was no longer just Lina. She was about to become a new part of this collective memory. Her own past, her childhood, her dreams, began to fade into pale photographs and slowly disappear into this vast sea of memory. She felt a deep fatigue seeping into her bones. Her eyelids grew heavy, as if lead had been poured over them. The massive bed in the middle of the room, still breathing slowly, was no longer frightening, but irresistibly inviting. She had to lie down there, to rest, forever. She walked towards the bed with mechanical steps. When she sat on the edge of the bed, the rib-like protrusions under the blanket moved, making room for her. When she let herself fall onto the bed, the mattress did not feel like a sponge, but like warm flesh, molding to the shape of her body and pulling her in. The blanket moved on its own, covering her up to her shoulders. With a final effort, Lina opened her eyes. The ceiling of the room was no longer a ceiling, but a living tissue, covered in veins, rhythmically contracting and relaxing. The beating of the hotel's heart was no longer a sound from outside, but a rhythm beating inside her own chest. Her eyes slowly closed, and her consciousness, like a drop of water merging with the ocean, completely dissolved into the dark, hungry, and eternal consciousness of the Sovereign Hotel. Lina's body remained motionless for a while within the fleshy texture of the bed. There was no longer a consciousness, a soul, inside it. Just an empty puppet, controlled by the hotel's massive organism. After the room had completely digested her, the hotel's heartbeat slowed, and the rhythmic contractions in the walls stopped. A purpose had been fulfilled. But this was not the end. It was only the first stage of a transformation. After a while, the collective ancient consciousness within the room sent a command to its new limb. It was not an order expressed in words. It was more like an irresistible, instinctive call, like a bee obeying the will of the hive. The body on the bed began to move slowly. Its movements did not belong to a human. Its joints bent at angles that seemed never to have been used before, its muscles contracting unnaturally. Its eyes were closed, but this did not prevent it from finding its way. The hotel was its new eyes. It saw through the walls, felt from beneath the floor. The blanket, like a shed skin, peeled off and was cast aside, and the body slowly slid down from the edge of the bed. Its feet landed softly, not on a creaking floor, but as if on the surface of an organ. The door, now a part of the room, opened. Silently as it approached, like the parting of a wound's lips. When the body stepped into the corridor, it no longer feared the shadows or the sounds there, because it was now one of those shadows. As it moved down the corridor, the echoes of the hotel's previous victims watched it from the gaps of other room doors. Their faces were indistinct, pale, curious, and with an almost jealous expression. They watched this new soul surrender to the hotel's will. The man with the mustache, the little girl, the woman in the old dress, they were all silent witnesses to this procession. They were the trapped memories in the hotel's mind. But Lina was different. She would not be just a memory. She would be a vessel for the hotel's next cycle. The call did not lead it to the elevator, but to a narrow door at the very end of the corridor that it hadn't noticed before, a door with no markings on it. This was the door to the service stairs. The door creaked open before it even touched it. The inside was pitch black and airless, but the body did not hesitate. It stepped into the darkness and began to climb the concrete steps leading up. With each step, the damp, cold water seeping from the walls touched its skin. This was the dirty, life-filled water that circulated in the hotel's veins, from the basement to the roof. The call was leading it to the source of this water, to the very top of the hotel, to the lonely and forgotten point where it met the sky. The climb continued with a slowness that felt like hours. Finally, a last metal door appeared before it. Water was dripping rhythmically from a rusty pipe above the door. The call was behind this door. The body did not pause when it reached the heavy metal door. There was no handle, no lock on it. Just a rusty, solid surface. but the will of the hotel was stronger than iron and rust. The body's fingers found a thin gap at the edge of the door. With a pressure that would have broken a normal person's nails crushed their fingers, the metal began to bend with a groan and a creak. As if opening a tin can, the edge of the door curled outward, creating a gap just wide enough for the body to pass. The cold night air and the distant hum of the city that seeped in briefly cut through the stagnant air of the stairwell. The body, bending its joints at unnatural angles, slipped through that narrow gap like a snake and found itself on the roof of the Sovereign Hotel. The roof resembled a forgotten industrial landscape more than a building top. The place was filled with rusty ventilation pipes, strangely shaped chimneys, and cylindrical black water tanks that stood like giant insects in the shadows. Below, the city lights twinkled like a distant pulsating galaxy, but the warmth of this glow could not reach this cold island of concrete and metal. The sky was cloudy. The moon and stars had drawn a veil over this sorrowful scene. The irresistible call from within the hotel was now even clearer, and it was coming from a single point, the massive water tank in the farthest corner of the roof, which looked larger and older than the others. The body began to move over the pipes and obstacles with a mechanical precision, where a human would have hesitated or lost their balance. When it reached its target, it stood beside the tank. It was a dark cylinder, almost 3 meters high, made of metal plates joined with rivets. On its side was a rusty iron ladder leading to the top. The body began to climb. Its movements were not fluid. They were jerky and strange, like a puppet being pulled by strings. With each step, the rusty metal made a painful sound. When it reached the top, it stood beside the massive circular lid on the tank. The lid looked so heavy and large that it would have taken at least 2 grown men to move it together. But within, the body was a strength far greater than that of a single person. The collective will of the hotel, the energy of all the victims it had accumulated over the years, was now gathered in the muscles of this empty body. The fingers gripped the edge of the lid. After a moment's pause, the muscles tensed, and with an ear-splitting screech of metal on metal, the lid slowly began to slide to the side. When the lid had moved enough to expose the tank's opening, the body looked down into the darkness. The inside was filled to the brim with a still black, ink-like water. The surface of the water, like a mirror, carried the pale reflection of the cloudy sky. And in that moment, something impossible happened. Within the body, that last piece, that final flickering spark of Lina's soul, which had been imprisoned in the deepest depths of the hotel's consciousness, briefly surfaced. The body's closed eyes opened, and it looked down into the water. In the reflection, it saw its own face. But this was not the face of the tired but vibrant girl who had entered the hotel. This was the final desperate image of a drowning soul. Its eyes wide with terror, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. This lasted for less than a second. Then the hotel's will took control again. The eyes closed, and that final spark was extinguished forever. The body, without the slightest hesitation, let itself fall forward and dropped into the dark water. It made almost no sound as it hit the water. And immediately after, the heavy metal lid, as if pushed by an invisible hand, slid back into place. That final, deep and metallic sound echoed in the silence of the roof, and then everything was quiet. Days passed after Lina's consciousness dissolved into the dark waters of the hotel. For the Sovereign Hotel, it was no different than a raindrop falling into the ocean, a momentary ripple, and then the ancient, still silence returned. Room 1308 had reverted to its original state, as if no one had ever stayed there. The cracked telephone receiver on the floor had vanished, The wounds on the bleeding door had closed, and the walls had once again taken on a lifeless cold texture. There was not a single wrinkle on the bed. Only a faint memory lingered in the air of the room, like the scent of a faded perfume. The last whisper that a soul had once existed there down below, life in the lobby, or the slow, decaying imitation of life that most resembled it at the Sovereign, continued. The old receptionist sat at his massive ledger, as if he had never lifted his head. Lina's 1-week reservation had expired. But the man cared neither for the unreturned key nor the absence of the guest. For him, guests were merely names in a book. A line was drawn when they arrived, and when they left, sometimes that line was never drawn at all. Some guests at the Sovereign never checked out. It was one of the hotel's unwritten rules. However, the other inhabitants of the hotel began to feel this new absence in a different way. An elderly woman on the 3rd floor complained that the water from her tap tasted strange, metallic, and slightly sweet. A businessman on the 7th floor said the water pressure had dropped inexplicably, with only a weak trickle coming from the shower. Some guests whispered that the sounds from the pipes at night had changed. It was no longer just the creaking of old pipes, but muffled, churning sounds, as if someone were moving slowly through the water. No one connected these small anomalies. They were seen as the usual problems of an old building and were ignored. But the hotel itself was aware of the change. The water circulating in its veins was no longer just water. It carried a new essence, a new memory. With every glass of water, every shower it offered to its new guests, the hotel was sharing a piece of its latest victim. It was slowly, imperceptibly, making them a part of its own consciousness. Lina had not left. She had merely changed form. She was no longer a guest. She was the hotel itself. And her silence from the depths of the Sovereign's walls, from the hum of the water pipes, from the dark and strangely flavored water that dripped from every faucet, was waiting for new victims. Lina's disappearance went unnoticed in the outside world at first. But her family, having not heard from her for days, began to worry and finally filed a missing persons report with the police. When the 2 detectives investigating the case arrived at the Sovereign Hotel, the last place she was seen, the heavy, decaying air of the lobby hit them like a slap. The old receptionist answered the detectives' questions indifferently, with monosyllabic replies. He showed them the yellowed page in the massive ledger. Yes, they had had a guest named Lina. No, he had not seen when she left. When the detectives went up to room 1308, they were met with a room that was perfectly tidy, as if it had never been used. The bed was made. The bathroom was clean. There wasn't a single speck of dust on the floor. There was no trace of Lina's personal belongings, including her backpack. It was as if the girl had evaporated into thin air. Weeks of investigation yielded no results. The other guests in the hotel had not seen her. There was no footage of her on the street cameras after she entered the hotel. The file was about to be shelved among the unsolved cases. However, one of the younger detectives could not let go of the last possibility that nagged at him: the hotel's security cameras. The receptionist said the hotel system was very old, that most of them didn't work, and that the recordings were of poor quality. Still, the detective insisted. In a damp, musty room in the basement, among a pile of videocassettes on an old desk, they found what they were looking for. The camera in one of the elevators was still recording. When they began to watch the footage, the empty cabin of the elevator appeared on the black and white grainy screen. After a while, the doors opened and Lina entered. But this was not the vibrant girl from her photos. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She quickly entered, turned to the button panel, and began to press multiple buttons at once. But the elevator did not move. Lina suddenly shrank into the blind spot of the cabin, right next to the door, as if hiding from someone in the corridor. She stood there motionless for a few seconds. Then, as if thinking the danger had passed, She slowly peeked her head out. The door, looking first to the left, then to the right. The corridor appeared to be empty. It was then that the strangest thing happened. Lina began to talk, as if to someone standing in the corridor whom the camera could not see. She made strange, fluid gestures with her hands, as if explaining something. Then she suddenly smiled, but it was not a joyful smile. It was a hysterical grin, filled with fear and desperation. The next moment, as if threatened by that invisible person, she quickly threw herself back into the cabin and huddled in the corner. She lunged at the panel one last time and frantically pressed all the buttons. And then, as if giving up, she slowly exited the elevator and disappeared down the dark corridor to the left. The elevator doors slowly closed behind her. The detectives stared at the static image on the screen. This recording had given them no answers. It had only provided a terrifying and silent proof of Lina's final moments, moments that defied all reason. The disturbing recording from the elevator, instead of being a turning point in Lina's case, dragged it into an even deeper mystery. When the video was leaked to the press, it created a nationwide sensation. Internet sleuths, paranormal investigators, and conspiracy theorists debated for weeks, analyzing every frame, every strange movement. Had she lost her mind? Was she on drugs? Or was she really interacting with someone the camera couldn't see? Each theory was crazier and more inadequate than the last. The Sovereign Hotel suddenly became the focus of the media, but the hotel's pale facade gave away none of its secrets. Meanwhile, the problems inside the hotel continued to escalate. The complaints about the water had become so numerous that they could no longer be ignored. The water's color had darkened. Its smell had become unbearable. The management finally, reluctantly, sent the hotel's old and grumpy maintenance man to check the main water tanks on the roof. The man grumbled as he climbed the rusty ladder he hadn't been on in years and stepped out into the windy emptiness of the roof. When he reached the largest water tank, he immediately understood the source of the problem. The tank's heavy metal lid was not completely closed. There was a slight gap at the edge. An animal had probably fallen in and decomposed. He pushed the lid aside with his flashlight. It was the heaviest lid he had ever seen in his life, and he couldn't fathom how it had been opened by a single person. When he had pushed the lid far enough and shone his flashlight into the dark water below, he saw nothing at first. The surface of the water was covered with a black, oily film. But then, the beam of his flashlight caught on something pale floating in the water. Cursing, the man focused the light on that spot. His blood ran cold at what he saw. Floating in the water, face up, her skin turned gray and swollen from weeks in the water, her eyes staring into the void, was the body of a woman. It was the missing girl. Lina. This horrific discovery closed the case but did not solve the mystery. According to the official reports, Lina, during a psychotic episode of unknown origin, had gone up to the roof, somehow opened that incredibly heavy lid by herself, and committed suicide by throwing herself into the tank. The Sovereign Hotel was cleared. The incident began to be forgotten. But the detectives, the hotel guests, and the millions of people who had watched that elevator recording knew that this simple explanation was just a cover for the truth. No one ever found out who Lina was talking to in the corridor that night, why she was hiding in the elevator, and most importantly, how she had opened that impossible lid. The Sovereign Hotel still stands in the middle of the city with its pale facade today. The grandfather clock in its lobby continues to count time with the same heavy rhythm. And sometimes at night, new guests staying on the 13th floor say they hear a muffled, wet whisper coming from within the walls, echoing in the water pipes like someone trying to breathe underwater.